Hello, everybody, and welcome to, I believe, the fourth edition of the Design Social, uh, Design System Social Club. Anyway, today I have Donna with me. Hey, Donna, how's it going?
Hi, it's going well. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Can you just, just in a few sentences, tell our audience who you are, where you are, what are you working on?
Yep. My name is Donna Vitian. I am the design lead for design systems for Telus Digital, and I'm in Toronto, Canada.
Welcome, welcome. And then we have Kelly. Hey, Kelly, how's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good too.
Good to be here.
Yeah, Kelly, you were not there on the previous stream, but you're one of the regular guests here. But can you just present yourself and who, where, what you're working on?
I'm Kalig. I work at Shopify on developer acceleration, and in the past I've worked on a few design systems, such as Polaris and the Lightning design system. So I no longer work in that space, but still very, very interested in. And I'm based north of Seattle in Kirkland, in Washington.
Cool. And just if anybody was curious to know, I'm working on IDS, which is the Intuit design system, and I live in Broomfield, Colorado, for almost a year now. But yeah, if the accent didn't give it already, I am from Paris, France. Anyway, today we'll be talking about documentation, and I think there's a lot of different things and ways we could go about it. But maybe very simply, we can start by saying what is our current state with documentation at our work or our current project. Anybody wants to start? Nope. Okay.
I can start. So our design system documentation for the Polaris admin is publicly available on polaris.shopify.com. It was overhauled last year, I believe, middle of last year. So far, this has been a great way for us to kind of give a sense of to the world of how we think about UX and the space that UX has at Shopify. But if you look at how Shopify has been growing over the past few years, we no longer just have one single product. We have a point of sales that's really important as well. We have invested in warehousing kind of user interfaces to manage warehouses, to manage workers on the warehouse floor, and to help them work. There's the Shop app, which is has tens of millions of users and is helping people track their packages and shop online. All of these have rather different use cases. It's not just about managing your shop anymore. It's about multiple experiences, and so we have multiple design systems now at Shopify. And last year we started an initiative to kind of start connecting the dots between all of these experiences and making it easier for folks to onboard when they come into a new team and to understand what principles drive each experience, and also understand what audiences we now serve. It's not just merchants. It's folks who are shopping online, and it's folks who are working in a warehouse, folks managing a warehouse. So the state of documentation is that we have documentation polaris.shopify.com. We have our internal version of that, which I think might become public at some point, but as of now it's still private. That summarizes the experiences that I was talking about. And then in Figma we have a lot of docs as well, and we have I would say 15 to 20 projects that are using Storybook as well to document their components. That's kind of the breadth of how documentation is done right now.
That's a lot of different places.
And then we have our internal wiki. We have an internal wiki as well. And then for more technical contributor docs, I think that lives more on GitHub. So I hope that gives you a bit of a sense of how dispersed information can be sometimes.
Yep, definitely, and it's an impressive setup, I must say. Donna, you want to go next?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a lot. So for Telus Digital, we have right now our design system is for just React Web. So it's mostly for web components. And again, we're in a state of transition because we're trying to build out now kind of more a platform agnostic and brand agnostic design system. So now we're looking at like how do we include the native mobile of Android, iOS components, as well as changing our design tools. And so all these things that need to change and then also kind of allow for community contribution. So where one team was managing, again, that single documentation now has to kind of grow and disperse into now to do these different things. So that's currently where we are at Telus Digital.
Wow. And by contribution, you mean internally, right? In your org, right?
Yeah. So like the different delivery teams create their own components and contribute back, but then also like how do we make it so that it's not all being filtered into one team to build it all out?
I see.
So tell us about Intuit.
Well, I think it's pretty similar to what you were describing, Kelly, but we do have a lot of different sources of truth, which is in a way problematic. So there is an old IDS for Intuit design system, but there's an old IDS website that is also just internally. And that's one of the things that is a little bit confusing for, especially for people outside of Intuit, is that if you're looking for the Intuit design system, you will find the QuickBooks design system, which is basically just one of our products. And so Intuit is actually on top of it. But we didn't launch anything public facing right now. So we're in the middle of trying to figure out how do we want to gather everything, but like we have multiple products supporting multiple platforms. So like it's actually quite challenging, and I'm actually in charge of the website in itself. So I am literally like trying to figure out how we make that happen. But like basically like you, Kelly, like we're using Storybook, we're using like GitHub too. Sometimes like there's like Confluence for wikis, websites. We're using Zeroheight now. We didn't publish it just yet, but there is like an internal Zeroheight. Are you aware? I mean, do you know what is this tool? Maybe I should explain even maybe for.
It's like a content management system for your design system in a way.
Exactly. It's very niche. It's really for design system, and it works very well, especially because like you, we're using Storybook and Figma, and it has great integration with both. And they're looking into integrating style dictionary, which is obviously a plus for us because we're leveraging all those components. So it's a great tool for now. And at the same time, like we're still growing and trying to merge the different sources of truth. But overall, there's one of the big principles for us is that we don't want to duplicate anything because it's a nightmare to maintain. So ideally, I would love to find a solution where we have one place to host all the content and then surface it at different places, right? It's like, I think it makes a lot of sense to have your documentation surfaced a little bit what you've done in the past, Kelly, actually with, what was it, Periscope in Polaris?
Yeah. So the way, one of the things that we built for Polaris.shopify.com is, okay, let me backtrack a bit. The way the way it was built initially was as a proof of concept for how we would be using React long term at Shopify. And so a lot of our tools that are now used in production in the actual Polaris and Shopify admin have been pioneered in the Polaris repo initially. And then it turns out GraphQL is a big part of how we build things. So when I joined, I saw this great GraphQL endpoint that was sitting there that nobody was using, and I started documenting it. And this is when we figured, what if we queried that GraphQL endpoint that is all of our data that you can query and get it back in JSON format. Essentially, it's design system as an API. So it's a design system API. And then so Nico, who now works at Figma, but at the time when he was an intern at Shopify, led this project during a hackathon of what if we brought Polaris inside Sketch, and so created a plugin. And I don't think at the time we ended up using the API itself, but that was the intent, to kind of broaden that. And then we had a few devs internally who also leveraged that API to either query component documentation, design tokens, the code. So that's the story. But sorry, that was a big sidebar here. Go ahead.
No,
I think
but I think it's actually, this is, I think, key in terms of design system documentation, right? It's like, and it's about being where your users are, and I'm talking obviously for internal users, right? But being in Figma, being in, like for your designers or in the IDE of your developers, I think it makes tons of sense. So there's, like a lot of thinking for us anyway around that. And at the same time, like I also believe that there are, even if you're talking about just components, right? There's a breadth of information around components, from the life cycle of the component to like guidance. How do you supposed to use it? What are related components that you might want to try if those doesn't work out? And so where do you store all this information, right? All those pieces of information, and where do you surface them? Because I don't believe that everybody needs everything at the same time all the time. So that's one thing on one end. So, like we're trying to figure out what we want to do with that. And on the other, I don't want to create silos at the same time, because there is, a very, and please let me know how you feel about it, because both of you also have multi-products, but, like if you're talking about surfacing the documentation for a certain kind of audience, let's say for my example, it's like one product for one platform. But at the same time, I feel like there might be a good reason why you still want to present what exists elsewhere. Let's say, like in your product, you have this component, but actually in another product, this kind of the same component is slightly different for those reasons, And so I don't want to create silos, but at the same time, I don't know, 80-90% of the time, people just want to have, I'm an iOS developer on QuickBooks. I don't care about the rest. Do you, I don't know, do you have any thoughts or opinion on those things? Nope.
I do, but Donna, I wanted to let you go first if you had anything.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that we're moving into is like a different design tool. And even though we're trying to build kind of a agnostic design system that you can theme, you can brand, the idea is like each brand, each product still has their own specific, like visual language that, they might not use like 50% of the components. And so when they look at that, their design system or their component library, like they only just want to see their stuff. They want discovery and awareness on like what else is available. But if you're just building your product page, you just want the components that you need, and you want access to that and not everything else. But you also want to see other things. So still exploring.
Yep.
Yeah, I think what I was going to say kind of ties into that there's a bit of, I see two modes in as far as a front-end developer goes, and I haven't built apps myself, but I imagine it might be quite quite the same. There's a mode of you're creating and you need to diverge quite a bit. You need to understand the scope of the solution you're trying to create, how it might impact other platforms. And so then you might need to, gather a lot of context across multiple platforms. You want a lot of breadth of information at the same time. However, the other mode, which is kind of more of an implementation phase, you kind of have a good idea of what you're going for. You need to have the right information and then at the right time in the right place. One thing we discovered on Polaris is that initially, Polaris had been championed by folks who were more on the content strategy side of things, that we now call content designers at Shopify. And so it's skewed a little bit towards, we're going to show you quite a bit of content and context first, and then we'll show you the implementation. But we discovered that came in the way of people who were more in the implementation phase. So as a creation tool and as a divergence tool, maybe it was the right way to display information. However, for people who just wanted to get shit done, that was that content at the top came in the way. So we ended up shuffling things around, shortening the introduction, putting the component examples pretty far up on the page, and then the content and all the context. If you need to go deeper, you're going to find that down in the page. And we found out that it made it a way more useful tool for devs and designers who are in the build phase.
Yeah, I definitely feel like, there is a tendency also for system people to, when they talk about their documentation, they want to show and they're almost passionate about their system and how beautiful it is and stuff like that. But sometimes it's actually not user centric. And when your user is just basically, I just want to copy paste the code. Thank you very much. I don't need it feels a little bit like those recipes websites where, you have this very long paragraph of a storytelling thing before you get to the actual recipe. And everybody's like, can you stop? I don't care. I just want to know how to cook this thing. But yeah, what about you, Donna?
Yeah, I think one of the things that, like Kalik said, we have a lot of the props at the very top, and then a little bit more implementation and guidance further down of the component and the documentation. And one of the things that we're trying to, now that we're moving to a different tool, is also include the accessibility implementation, because implementing the code you also need to include how the different ways how accessibility can be included in the implementation. You can't just here's a button, that's it. There's different ways to have accessibility text also appear. So we're trying to also include that in our upcoming documentation.
But so question for you, do you actually include design guidance and implementation guidance in the same document, or do you separate those two because they're vastly different audience?
The way our documentation is right now, and you can check it out at tds.telus.com, is it's very kind of concise documentation. And so we do want to flesh it out with more guidance, more design guidance, just because a component is there. One of the things that we want to say is hey, maybe you don't need to use this because there are other design solutions that you could do. But maybe that isn't the right way, because maybe, people just want to implement right away. So I think we're going to try out a few things, just because we know there's some things missing in our documentation today.
I see. And what about you, Kelly? Is it everything at the same place, or?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mix. We have content strategy, design guidelines, demos of examples of the components running in the browser, screenshots of what they look like in iOS and Android. What else? And then accessibility. Did I say content design? Yeah, all of this is mixed together. Until very recently, front end was part of UX at Shopify. And yeah, so for us, it was kind of a no-brainer to include all of this in the same place.
Okay. But do you feel like, I don't know, do you have like any feedback on the fact that maybe like, as you mentioned, like some things get in the way, or like designers complaining that, I don't know, the implementation is first and it should be like they don't care about it, or it's so far you didn't really get any things like that?
No, I think people are pretty visual. So whether they're a designer or a developer, or a content designer or whoever might be looking at these components, having the demos is very useful. Yeah, I mean, there's always people who just want to get in, copy paste some code, get out, and all they're trying to do is put a layout together. A lot of our internal tooling teams don't necessarily have a front-end developer or a designer on their team, and they use Polaris, which is awesome, and it makes them go from 0 to hero in just a few minutes, and all they have to do is copy paste some code. They don't really have to understand everything that is going on there. And I think this is a valid use case. It's okay. It's okay. However, our product designers, especially as they become more senior, we expect them to kind of try to understand the why, how things are made the way they are, and to reflect on when to stretch the system as well, not just consume the docs and take that as a given, but also really look at how to breach outside of those boundaries. And I think this is where that documentation is extremely useful. I also think that one of the things we could be better at, and I've seen that in a few other design systems, to be honest, is explaining the why. It would be a lot of content, and some of it might not be useful for public consumption, or actually not desirable to make public. So we kind of shied away from investing too much in explaining the why behind every single component and the entire history behind it. But for people to start challenging the system, they need to have that information, and I think we need to get better at this kind of stuff. And it's hard because the incentives to write such documentation, they're not always embedded in the culture of companies and teams, and so it's a big shift in mindset for the company to do that at scale.
Yeah, no, for sure. I was actually thinking about the fact that, to me, like, one of the key interrogation that I have is, like, as you mentioned, like, if you start to explain the why things are the way they are, you also almost need to have some kind of change log to tell the history of the component, right? It's like, at one point it was like this, and then we discovered that, so we changed it, Yeah, and
the research findings, the research insights behind components is something we've been wanting to do. And I think, just maybe org structure. I'm not sure exactly how, like, why we never ended up doing it. And also, like, we didn't have that many researchers at Shopify, and so that didn't help. But it's hard. And also sometimes the research has a lot of proprietary data of merchants that have been interviewed, and so it's kind of a touchy subject to bring that to Polaris.
I mean, even if you don't show the data, but like, basically, like, giving the rationale and the evolution of, like, we had a V1 of that component, and then we moved to a V2 because it was performing better. Like, you don't necessarily need to get into the details, but like, do you give that kind of information? Is, as you mentioned, I think that somebody that is just consuming the like the components or the design system in general don't necessarily need to have the whole story. But at the same time, if you want to challenge what's there, you need to understand that it just didn't come out of a hat one day by chance. Like, there were some things and some discussions and some decisions made.
Yeah.
Yeah. You want to say something, Dana?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of top up on that, like just internally, when our design system community gets together, like someone will propose an update to a component or a new component, and there actually is a design history and rationale for like why things didn't work out and why you shouldn't have done that. And so internally, like that lives in Google Docs, but like when we did a workshop about more than a year ago, like what should be included in the documentation is yeah, like include the history and the rationale, so that you can also see like, hey, this was out of scope, but now we have time for it, or any future improvements that wasn't included in the current version. So
Yep.
it starts to get a lot once you put like your wish list of what to include.
Yeah, and there's definitely like I see like clearly that difference between consuming the system and contributing to the system, and even maybe like in the end, when I'm guessing like it doesn't really apply to us at Intuit, but Kelly for Shopify, like people outside of the company but still leveraging the system because they build their own, I don't know, like they want to use the Shopify APIs or what like tools that you're providing. Like those buckets are very different. So I mean, to me, like I don't know what is the best mechanism basically to surface this, like the different depth, and also like are you like part of the like I don't want to sound it too cliquey, but are you part of the club and do you actually want to and need to access this kind of information, or is it just like like it's just you want the high level and the latest and greatest and you don't want to hear the backstory of the origin story of everything. But
yeah, it's tough. Progressive disclosure of information is hard to it's hard to put together well, because you're creating content for a niche, and the payoffs are very hard to see in the short term.
Yep.
And things are going so fast in tech that it's hard to invest in that kind of stuff and to support investments towards that. But thankfully, we have great leaders at Shopify who are dedicating a lot of passion towards making that happen. So I'm hoping we'll get as far as Telus and in that space and get to that level of documentation for every single component. I'm not sure we do right now. Yeah, maybe some teams at Shopify do, but I don't know if in the admin that's the case. Yeah.
Actually, I think it's a great segue to maybe another perspective on documentation, is that how do you motivate people to write documentation? Because it's not necessarily a given, right? Either you're a designer or a developer, but to me, like, I know Atlassian, for example, is doing has a culture of documenting everything, but I think it's edge case, or I didn't see that happening very often. So do you have any, I don't know, like good or bad experience, or how to motivate people to actually write more and better documentation?
Maybe I'll jump in.
Go for it. Yeah.
So when our design system started, it was a core team that was managing it, and then we wanted to create a community for that contribution. And what happened is, like everyone wants to contribute, but it turns out that like we put in kind of guardrails where like you have to have all this like design ready, you have to have all the documentation, like we had a template of documentation. And so like it's nice to have because you want to deliver quality, but what we discovered is that like this is actually taking a lot of time, and then it kind of like makes people not want to do it, or maybe they don't have all of that ready, and so it slowed down that contribution model. So what we're trying to figure out is like really what is the MVP to release documentation on a component. And then again, yeah, you're right. How do you inspire other people to continue and fill it out? So That's
Yeah. Let
interesting.
me ask you a question though. So who do you feel should write the documentation? Is it the person that is actually creating, for example, the component, meaning the designer, or the developer that is implementing the component, or is it like dedicated content teams? How does it play out for you?
Right, right. I think you have to have both, right? Because there's design rationale of like how to use this component or like why you should use it, and then the implementation from the developer of like how to do that. So they have to fill out their boxes.
So usually you would say that, like they're doing like a first draft, and then do you have content designers that are reviewing the content, or is there like some, I don't know, like peer reviewing system in place?
Yeah, so there is a review system in place. We want to include, well, we haven't yet, but we do want to include content designers because aside from the actual component documentation, there might be another section of that documentation website of like, this is our value, our principles, this is how we're going to build a page. So there are other things that are not just like component specific that we want to like make clear. So much work.
Indeed. What about you, Kelly? Who's contributing, like the actual creators, or is there like a review process? Anybody can contribute. What's the setup for you?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about components specifically, we tried a big ass template in GitHub, an issue template, no, and I think zero users. And it was very complete, very, very good, very complete, but nobody used it. So that was a fail. But yeah, otherwise it's the designer quite a bit. And then for things that go into Polaris, typically we have some content designers who help and who even like take it on themselves. Now for how to motivate people to write that documentation, we did a lot of research and a lot of thinking about this. Something that stood out for me was there's a lot of things that came. My memory is failing me, but I remember one thing in particular, which was what if we made that part of the career ladder, the kind of job level expectations that when you start gravitating towards those like senior plus levels, you're not just thinking about your own feature and your own team's problems, but you're trying to scale that knowledge to your product line or even to Shopify in some instances. And so how do you do that? Well, you could contribute internally, you could contribute to give a talk internally, do demos, etc. But sometimes it's also good to do that through Polaris. So, that's a nice little line you can put on your, promo sheet for whenever you're chasing that level up, or if if you're looking for a nice bump in compensation. This is always like to show, oh, by the way, I'm ticking those boxes. It's not we're not trying to play a game of ticking boxes to get to the next level, but it's those little incentives in the kind of growth culture. So there's that. And then for devs, I think devs need to write documentation, and this comes in this place of in the form of giving examples of how components are being used and writing good documentation for the props in something like React. So yeah, just for me, giving an incentive for people to do that, go through a tool like Storybook. And I think for me, that's the best forcing function I've seen, because by creating stories and creating those examples of components, they get instant value out of it. They get test cases. So from an engineering perspective, this is fantastic. They can also share progress on the development of a component with the rest of the team pretty fast. And then for the props, documenting props in TypeScript or in React, that doesn't yield instant value to you as a developer until that gets surfaced in Storybook too. So all of a sudden, not only you have examples of a few components, but also the kind of props playground that you get at the bottom, the controls kind of panel lets you play around with those, and having documentation appear directly on there is just instant gratification of good documentation practices. So for me, those are kind of forcing functions that can be useful for devs.
Yeah. Do you feel like then, like if there then a reason why you should comment your code outside of what is actually, if you have good documentation, if you have like good storybook stories and stuff like that, like, do you still feel like there's a need to write comments inside of your code, or maybe it's at this point overkill? Or is there like two different use cases?
I like code that's expressive on its own, because comments typically get out of date pretty fast if they are used in lieu of documentation. So then you end up maintaining an inline documentation plus the code, and that gets to me that gets out of sync too quickly every time. So what I like to use comments for, though, is anything that's kind of quirky, that's weird bug that you had to go around, or like something by reading the code, it would be very hard to write code that is expressive enough that it would tell the story behind why that code is that way. Because sometimes you have to make trade-offs, and the next person reading it might think, that is stupid. Well, who wrote this? And it turns out there was a story behind it. And sometimes you have to tell that story in the comments. That's my way of thinking about it. And I know that certain teams make make code comments surfaced in documentation. So then you're not just maintaining comments in your code. It's actually you're maintaining actual documentation at this point, or metadata about the component and that sort of stuff. And I think Salesforce is doing that super well, where all of that metadata, all that documentation at the top of their SAS files gets surfaced on the website and actually used to kind of create a graph, a design system graph of all the components, what the interdependencies are. And I think that's super smart. So yeah, kudos to Salesforce for that.
Yeah. Yeah, like years ago, I was actually creating for a German startup a lifestyle guide before it was actually called a design system. And I was scraping the comments from the code to actually automatically publish the style guide. But yeah, I mean, to me, like there is still a beauty in that. I think one of the main thing for me was more the fact that if your documentation is right next to your code, there's a higher chance that you will actually update it. Maybe it's just wishful thinking, but I feel like as opposed to like if a developer has to like write his code or write their code, and then go to another place to actually write the documentation, I was feeling that it was less likely that they would do it if it was not directly there with it at the same place, But I don't know. I mean, at the same time, it cannot be the solution for everything. So it needs to be a mix of different solutions, I feel personally. Yeah.
But I agree with you on the being close to the code.
Yeah.
When the documentation you have to maintain is close to where the work happens, I think that's better. So I'm a big believer in documentation being in GitHub personally. Some might not agree with that, but there's a lot of value in having it being so close to the code. So
let's take the opposite and say, because I think you said that earlier, but you said that you had also some documentation in Figma. And I've seen a lot other places where this happens, and to me, it's problematic for various reasons. I do believe that designers can start writing documentation in Figma, but I don't think it should be the official document that is referred to once it's published. But I would love to hear what is the use case for you, and where is a good use of Figma as a documentation tool or not. And Donna, I'm sure you probably have an opinion on that too.
Sorry, yeah, not. Okay. So, Donna, do you want to go first?
Oh, okay. So right now for the design tool in Sketch, we only really have like links to the documentation site, but then we also have like specific Sketch quirks. So it's almost like the documentation we have in there is just like why it's not working the way it should when it's in real life, versus like, hey, in Sketch we have to fake a few things. So like that's how we limit the documentation in there. And
it almost feel like what Kelly was explaining about code, where you're like, yeah, it's more like a footnote where you're like, yeah, it's there for a reason, don't touch it, But yeah, please go on.
But I think like in Figma, like what do people expect in terms of like what amount of documentation in Figma itself? Because there's the component, but then there's also like, hey, here's the whole frame where it has like all the different variants and how to use that component. It's a little bit different. So yeah, I'm looking forward to Kayleig's answer.
Yeah, I haven't looked at our Figma files in a while, so I'm not sure I can talk to how we are doing things right now. But from a high level perspective, I think you have to do with what you have on hand, and sometimes you don't have a whole team of devs who are able to create a whole website for you. So in my opinion, if Figma is where most of the work happens in your UX group of folks, and you don't have a team to help you create a polaris.shopify.com, you got to do what you got to do. So I'm not judging anyone, seriously. It's like some documentation is better than none. And so if you're going to document, do it wherever you can.
Yeah.
And hopefully the devs have easy access to those docs as well. It's not just the kind of closed garden just for the designers. But yeah.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I'm not for like keeping the official documentation in Figma, because I feel like already like, yeah, it's pretty easy. It should be pretty easy for anybody to access it, but at the same time, it will never be as accessible as a website, or and you cannot search it. And I mean, the word processor inside of Figma is not the greatest even. So it's like, at the same time, I totally agree with you, Kelly, that like sometimes this is the best that you have, and it's also the easiest, and it's better than nothing. Totally. Side note, I've also seen developers creating basically blog articles inside of Storybook because they wanted to keep some documentation. And to your point, it's like, well, I'm day in and day out in Storybook, and I can do it there. So why not? It's technically feasible. It's possible. Should you be using your Storybook for other stuff than a component library? I want to say no, but at the same time, I understand that when you only have that as a tool, that you leverage what you can. But yeah, I think it's interesting. And don't get me wrong, the fact is that inside of Intuit, some system designers have a very exhaustive documentation living in Figma right now, and it's great. It's my only concern with that is that how do we update it? How do we keep it updated so that like people are referencing? Because one of the things that we're struggling most actually right now is the fact that there's so many different sources of documentation or sources of truth that it's really confusing for everybody to know what is the most updated version, right? It's like, I personally feel like any documentation piece needs to have a timestamp. saying at least this was 2 days ago, 6 months ago, or something like that, because at least it gives you an idea of like how much I can rely on this information or what. But I think it's obviously, like, I mean, among all the stuff that we basically talked about, like, it's like you want to make it easy to participate and contribute and write documentation, but at the same time, you need to build trust. Like, how do you make people, like your consumer, trusting your documentation that it's up to date to, like what is the actual reality of, I don't know, code, for example, because we didn't talk actually about that, but in my mind, the source of truth ultimately is code, because it's what is experienced by your users. So the documentation is already something else. It's actually not necessarily. It should be as close as possible to the truth of code, but sometimes it gets out of sync. So anyway,
yeah, I think this is a bit of a knowledge management issue. Companies are also struggling with this. What are the information silos? What are the pockets of knowledge that are disseminated across the company that not everyone has? So you end up with like operations teams who restrict the number of tools that people can use, or you can use whatever tool you want, but for documentation that should be available to the rest of the company, you have to use certain tools. This is where we store knowledge. Yep. And then, yeah, I think I would be curious actually to know, maybe you folks have that on your teams, like knowledge management experts, or no? I don't know.
Nope, but we should. I think it's a great idea.
Well, I think that's why we need documentation, so that that person doesn't have that knowledge in them.
Well, yeah.
All these librarians that are going to be out of a job, because of this company that starts with a big A. It's got this little smiley face logo. Maybe they can join our design systems teams, and then we can have fun.
Definitely. But yeah, no, I think you're making a great point. Like, I'm always, like, one of the things that I'm always fighting against is what I would call tribal knowledge, right? And especially on the design system, is like, yeah, you need to talk to like that person to know like the whole story behind it. Like, this is not scalable. So definitely, how do you share that information? And actually, I was thinking there's like one aspect that we didn't really cover is, when you make a change in the documentation, do you communicate that change, or do you have like automatic process to actually make people aware that there's new content, or you just, like leave them discover that things have changed? What's your strategy there?
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about a big change or a small change? Because maybe that's gonna be different.
Well, that's, I think, part of the problem, right? It's like, what is the threshold where you actually want to communicate and not over communicate every time there's like a comma added or something like that?
So for us, when components get updated or released, sometimes we put like a big message on Slack with like emojis and bullets, and but I think people are getting to the point where like anything big is just like you scroll past it and you don't look at it anymore. So what we're looking into is, do we have a completely different website, or maybe a section of the documentation site where it is like, it's not really a change log, it's like a release, like just for updates. So we're looking into it.
Cool.
Yeah, we have the what's new page, which is kind of buried at the bottom of the of the footer. But yeah, and then internally we use Slack announcements. We have the Polaris newsletter, and then the UX ops team. I like what they do. I think it's once every 2 weeks or maybe a month, they announce like, these are all the additions to our UX handbook, and they do such a great job at curating and promoting that content and tracking the readership. So without inundating people, because they know that information churn. Like there's just so much context you could spend your entire weeks just reading new content and watching the videos that people have been, and the demos that people have been posting, and the tips and tricks to be more productive, and then you would end the week with having done nothing. So.
I think that the useful part of it is that you're not reaching out to someone and they have to re-explain things, right? Like even if it is a tip or a trick, like here's the link, because we don't have to have a meeting about this.
Yeah, it's true. Well, yeah, I mean that's actually another strategy that you can put in place, right? It's like, how do you curate the questions that are coming over and over again so you can actually feed the document? Like it basically tells you, yeah, there's something missing in your documentation if people are still asking that question, right? So I think it's also an interesting feedback loop that you can put in place. That said, it's also easier said than done sometimes, but I know that we try different things internally, and for now anyway, we didn't necessarily found the silver bullet. So.
Yeah, one thing that's simple to do, requires a bit of discipline, but it's simple to do, is every time somebody's asking a question on Slack, if they haven't done that, like we have other issue boards, but people mostly come and ask on Slack when it's a just quick question. And then what we do is that we take note of what that was, the kind of topic that related to the date, who was air traffic controller, the person that's kind of on call for the day. And then we track all of these questions in a big spreadsheet, very, very low tech kind of thing.
Who's responsible for that? Who does that job? Like,
so we have rotations. We use something called pager duty which is what engineers, like on-call engineers would be using.
Yeah.
And then we have this air traffic control role that is somebody in the team for, typically it's just one day, and then depending on how many, you just rotate through the members of the team, so that everybody gets a bit of an idea of what pain points our users are getting. And your role is not to answer every single question. Your role is to direct traffic, the questions to the people or to the platforms or to GitHub issues, Discourse, whatever, to the right place, or to the right person. That's it.
But it's also their job, the air traffic person, to actually capture those questions and put them in a spreadsheet. Interesting. Yeah. That's actually, I mean, it's low tech, but it's cool.
And then we we get themes that are recurring, and then I don't know what the team is doing with it right now, but the goal has always been to keep track of that and
it's the suggestion box
thing.
But you know who's really into support? It's Isha, who, when she was working at Salesforce, put a whole support strategy in place, because there was so many sources of people asking for help that and it turns out Salesforce has a support tool, like a social media kind of support tool. And I think she leveraged that. And so if you want to invite her to the
why not,
to the show to talk about support,
definitely,
she knows a lot.
Interesting. Yeah, support could definitely be a topic of a next stream for sure. But yeah, I was actually thinking, does anybody try to have, I don't know, like a Slack bot or something like that can answer simple questions?
Yeah, we have that as well.
Okay. Does that work?
We put a few triggers. So when somebody joins the channel for the first time, or actually every single day, what teams do is that there's a new Slack message in the Polaris channel, or in my case, my current team is called Web Foundations. There's a message that appears. Your air traffic controller for the day is blah, blah, blah. And then here's where to find information to self-serve, to kind of troubleshoot your issues. Search there first. Then if you don't find anything, Slack, we're here on Slack. And also, if some people type something and we've captured an error message that we know, keeps coming back. We've set a bot that just whenever somebody says that, it answers with, "Hey, here's the thread. Go there."
I see. That's cool. But so you have like every day the same message that appears to tell you like who's the air controller and like all the all the links to all the resources.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
we even have and I can't remember if it's embed already. Slack has that, but if you ask something instead of posting it in the channel, I think it's telling you just you're the only person who can see it. That,
I see.
hey, you've asked about something that it's been
Yeah.
answered in the past, and that happened to me a few days ago where I had to troubleshoot something with my laptop, and the bot told me, and it didn't send a support request or anything. It just told me out of the automatically.
Cool. Yeah. I was just thinking that if I had the same message every day on my main channel at one point, I would probably be tired of it. But
And it's a long message as well because there's so many links in there.
Yeah.
But it's fine. Like it's people join the company or join the channel and they haven't seen that before. So
yeah, of course.
Yeah, but it's not our team channel. Like that's not where we're having chats about design systems.
Gotcha.
It's more like a support channel.
Yeah. Interesting. Cool.
We have something similar on ours where it's actually like every week, and it's like the TDS support hero. So like again, daily rotation, and there's always a developer and designer together for the week. So like they're either
That's
directing
nice.
you to the right place or answering the questions. And then we try to put like a little fun message, right? Really personalize it because it was all about building that friendly engagement.
Nice.
Yeah, we do have something like in our support channel, Slack channel. We have like it's more about giving you like the idea of how and what to and how to ask your question if you need support from a design system. But yeah, it's like pre-formatted and it's always the same. But
Yeah, it's important to remember people how to ask their questions so that you can have qualified support answers as well.
yeah,
It's not enough to ask like, "Hey, it doesn't work. Like, why is it not working?" And then, okay, yeah. So yeah, it's always useful to get a sense of what project are you talking about. Do you have a pull request, or is there a Figma file? All these things. If they have already pre-filled that when they took the time to write a good support request, it's and also you feel like they've put actual thought into this. It's not just the first
Lazy?
bump no. I mean, people will do what they have to do to get through their week and the job done. So yeah.
Cool. I think we're sliding to support, and we've been already like talking for 58 minutes now, so maybe we should put a pin on
Let's
that.
close it. It's a good way, a good segue maybe for the next
Next
one
week.
if we want to have a next topic that is support. I love it.
Yeah, definitely. Anybody has like a last question, comment, or anything on documentation? Or we just happy to be on weekend? I'm happy. I can tell it. I can say that. I'll be happy to go and pick up my kids now. So thanks, Donna. Thanks, Kelly.
Good luck with that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Again,
Thank you.
I learned a ton, and I'm sure everybody will enjoy that discussion as well. So thank you very much for being with me today and talk about our how can I say shop. We're talking
I
shop.
guess
It's fine.
Your intros and outros
Yeah.
are the best. They're just like
We need a
the best.
sign off message. It's
Yeah.
awesome. Documentation is cool.
Yeah. Peace out.
Yeah, that's
Enjoy.
right. That's right.
Enjoy and have a good one, everybody.
All right. Just good to be here. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.